At 17, she had learned that life could twist the heart in ways no child should endure. Orphaned after a bitter winter that had claimed both her parents, she found herself alone, wandering the rough dirt roads of the frontier with nothing but a tattered shawl and a stubborn glint of defiance in her eyes. The small town she had called home was now filled with whispers, some of sympathy, others of cruel curiosity. But none of that mattered when the local authorities delivered the decree that would shatter what little peace she had left. She was to marry a young Apache warrior. The idea made her stomach turn. Marriage, she knew, was meant to be an act of love, not a transaction forced by outsiders deciding the fates of the powerless. But her opinion counted for nothing. She had no protector, no family, and the men who had governed her life now claimed she was to serve as a bridge between settlers and the tribe. They called it diplomacy. She called it imprisonment. Her journey to the Apache village was long and grueling. She rode in a covered wagon with men whose eyes lingered too long, muttering words of comfort that felt more like warnings. Every mile she traveled, the weight of the unknown pressed harder against her chest. Who was this young man? Would he be cruel? Or would he treat her as some curiosity to be owned? She had heard stories of settlers abducted and forced into lives they had never wanted. Her mind conjured 1,000 versions of what awaited her. When she first glimpsed the village, nestled in the shadow of red sandstone cliffs, she saw smoke curling into the sky, and the distant outline of teepees arranged with quiet order. There was an eerie calm in the air, broken only by the distant calls of children and the rhythmic pounding of someone at the tanning station. And then she saw him, the young Apache who was to be her husband. He was taller than she had imagined, lean and strong with eyes the color of dusk, dark yet reflective of some secret world she could not yet understand. He approached slowly, deliberately, his gaze steady but not threatening. There was a dignity in his posture that made her bristle. He was not a man to be bullied or rushed, yet her fear flared instantly. She averted her eyes, clutching the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She would not show weakness, not to him, not to anyone. The first words between them were sparse. He spoke softly in a language she could barely comprehend, though she caught enough to understand that he was introducing himself, welcoming her. She could not speak back, her tongue feeling heavy and foreign in her mouth. She wanted to scream, to demand freedom, to run back down the winding path that had brought her here, but she was trapped. The village gates were closed to her, and no friendly face awaited her return. That night she lay on a mat in the teepee assigned to her, staring at the low ceiling, her mind a storm of panic and resentment. Outside, the wind howled through the cliffs, rattling the canvas and mingling with the distant calls of animals. Her body trembled, not from the cold but from fear. She hated him, she decided, simply for existing in the role assigned to him, for being the reason her life had been stolen. Yet, as she listened to the quiet movements outside her small shelter, she could not help but notice the calmness in his approach. He did not force himself upon her, did not demand obeisance or obedience. There was a patience in the way he moved, in the way he respected her space that unsettled her. Anger warred with a strange curiosity she could not name. By the time the first faint light of dawn crept through the cracks in the canvas, she was exhausted, her heart heavy with dread and confusion. She knew this was only the beginning, that a life imposed upon her was about to collide with a man she did not understand, and whose touch she feared might change everything she thought she knew about herself. In that quiet, anxious morning, she realized with a shiver that her story had been rewritten, and the first page was being inked in fire and uncertainty. The first night in the village felt like stepping into a world both alien and suffocating. The teepee they had assigned her smelled faintly of smoke and earth, and the woven mats on the ground did little to soften the chill creeping into her bones. She refused to look at him, sitting stiffly at one corner, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders. Her hand shook, partly from the cold, partly from the storm of emotions raging inside her. He moved quietly around the small space, arranging the few belongings she had brought, his movements deliberate and careful. There was no arrogance in his presence, no boastful claims to ownership. Still, the weight of being a stranger in his home pressed down on her chest, making every breath feel heavy. She kept her eyes down, her thoughts a tangle of anger, fear, and a stubborn desire not to give him even a fragment of herself. "I won't lie to you," he said softly, his voice carrying across the narrow space. You are frightened. You have every right to be. I do not expect you to understand me or this life yet. Her jaw tightened. She did not reply. Words felt dangerous, too intimate. She would not speak. She would not yield. The storm outside grew louder, rain lashing against the canvas with an insistent rhythm, lightning illuminating the small interior in brief white flashes. The thunder rolled like distant war drums, and in that relentless noise she felt trapped, not just by the teepee, but by the inevitability of her situation. She could not escape, and he did not try to force her. That somehow made her fear and resentment twist into something unfamiliar: curiosity. He knelt down, not too close, respecting the fragile boundary she maintained. I know this is not what you wanted, he said. But fear and anger are not enemies, they are guides. Listen to them, but do not let them rule you. She wanted to recoil, to tell him he knew nothing of her life, her suffering. But his calmness was disarming, and despite herself, she noticed the care in his movements, the gentleness in the way he treated the space as if it were sacred. Hours passed with the storm's fury beating against the world outside. She listened to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the subtle sounds of his presence, a hand brushing against a pot, the soft murmur of a song she did not understand. Somewhere beneath her fear, a seed of something new began to stir. It was not love, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. He was real, and he was patient, and for the first time, she felt that not every man who claimed her could break her completely. A crash of thunder made her flinch, and without thinking, she leaned back against the wall of the teepee. He moved instantly, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder, not demanding, not restraining, simply offering grounding. Her breath hitched. The touch was electric, though gentle, and she jerked away, eyes wide with shame and surprise. Do not be afraid, he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. I will not hurt you. But she was afraid of what she felt in that moment, afraid of the strange pull his presence had on her body and mind. She wrapped herself tighter in the blanket, wishing the night would end, wishing the storm would pass, wishing she could vanish entirely. By the time the first streaks of dawn crept across the horizon, the storm had weakened to a drizzle. She had not spoken, and neither had he forced a conversation. Yet the tension had shifted, subtle, undeniable. She was still terrified, still resentful, but now a whisper of curiosity threaded through her fear. She noticed how he moved, how his hands were careful, how his gaze was steady. Perhaps he could be endured, perhaps even understood, though she would never admit it aloud. That night, as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she realized something she could not yet name. Boundaries had been tested, and though she resisted, a small part of her longed to see what lay beyond them. The young Apache had entered her world not with violence, but with patience, and in that patience he had already begun to burn away the walls she had built around herself. The morning after the storm, the village was bathed in soft golden light. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, a mixture that reminded her of home, though home was a memory now more fragile than her own heartbeat. Reluctantly, she stepped outside the teepee, expecting hostility or at least cold indifference from her new husband. Instead, she found him tending to the children of the village. He moved with an ease that spoke of long practice, guiding the smallest hands in weaving, laughing quietly when a boy stumbled, kneeling to tie the laces of a girl's moccasins. There was no pretense, no effort to appear superior or intimidating. He simply was, and in that being he commanded a respect she could not ignore. She stayed hidden behind the teepee, watching him, her heart a chaotic tangle. Her fear and resentment did not vanish, but something curious began to prick at the edges of her consciousness. He was not the savage she had imagined. He was not cruel or brutish. He was human, tender, precise, patient. And in watching him, she glimpsed a world beyond the rigid confines of her own fear. Later, he returned to their small dwelling to fetch a basket of herbs. She pretended not to notice him at first, her eyes fixed on the ground, her arms crossed. But he spoke to her softly, in a mixture of English and Apache, explaining what each herb was for, how they could be used to ease aches, calm nerves, or heal wounds. You do not have to learn fast, he said quietly. The earth teaches us in its own time if we listen. The words, simple as they were, unsettled her. There was no pressure, no condescension, just an offering of knowledge shared without expectation. For the first time since being thrust into this life, she considered that perhaps she could endure. If only she observed, learned, and stayed alive long enough to understand this place. He took her to the edge of the village, where a small stream wound through the trees. She watched him demonstrate the art of fishing with a handmade spear, his movements fluid and exact. When he caught a small fish, he offered it to her. Their fingers brushed once, just a fleeting contact, and she recoiled, startled by the warmth, the subtle shock of his skin against hers. "Do not fear my touch," he said gently. "It is not meant to hurt you." She wanted to protest, but no words came. All she could do was stare at him, torn between resentment, disbelief, and the strange, budding intrigue that she had begun to feel. Each small act, the way he cared for others, the way he treated her without force, began to chip at her defenses, though she would never admit it aloud. As the day passed, she noticed how the villagers respected him, listening when he spoke, seeking his guidance. He was young, yet there was a quiet authority in him, the kind that stemmed from wisdom rather than fear. She realized that he was not just a man she had been forced to marry. He was someone the world had taught to survive, to protect, to nurture, and to endure in ways she had never known. By evening, as she returned to their teepee, her body ached from chores and learning, but her mind was restless in a new, dangerous way. She found herself watching him more closely, analyzing his movements, his interactions, his gestures. The boundaries she had built around her heart were still there, but they trembled, tested by the realization that the young Apache was not the enemy she had imagined. He noticed her gaze and smiled. Just once, a brief flash of warmth that made her pulse quicken. She looked away, cheeks burning, and busied herself with preparing the small fire for the night. But sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of hands that were gentle, eyes that were kind, and a touch she both feared and longed for. By the time the first stars appeared in the sky, she understood something she could not yet admit even to herself. She had begun to see him not merely as a captor, but as a person, and that realization carried with it both terror and a thrill she could not ignore. The days in the village had begun to stretch in strange, unexpected ways. What had once been pure fear and resentment toward her husband was now tangled with something she dared not name. Every glance, every small movement of his, seemed charged with meaning, though she fought to convince herself it was only imagination. It happened one afternoon while they worked side by side, helping with the preparation of hides and food. She had been clumsy, fumbling with a tanned hide that refused to cooperate, and he leaned over her shoulder, guiding her hands. Their fingers brushed, lightly, almost accidentally, but the shock of it made her jerk away, her pulse racing. "I did not mean to startle you," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "It is only my hand, only guidance." She swallowed hard, her mouth dry, and forced herself to focus on the hide. But the memory of that touch lingered, electric and insistent. She hated herself for noticing it, for the warmth that spread through her at the simplest contact. She had never felt like this before. Never felt her body respond with such intensity to a man she had once considered an enemy. He did not push, did not comment further, but she could see in his eyes that he had noticed too. There was a patience there, a quiet acknowledgement that he understood the power of touch and the danger it could carry in a body untrained in desire. His presence was magnetic, and though she tried to resist, her curiosity grew. Later, he led her to a small garden where herbs and vegetables grew in neat rows. She watched as he demonstrated how to plant, how to care for the fragile sprouts. Again, he guided her hands, holding them for just a moment longer than necessary. This time she did not pull away immediately. The warmth of his hand, the strength coiled beneath his fingers, made her pulse quicken. She caught herself thinking how different this touch was from any she had ever experienced. Gentle yet alive with force, grounding yet awakening. A sudden breeze sent a leaf tumbling across the garden, and he reached to catch it, brushing his fingers against hers again. The contact lingered, a spark that seemed to set the small garden ablaze in her mind. She wanted to recoil, to retreat into the walls she had built so carefully, but her body betrayed her. Leaning just slightly closer without conscious thought, "You are learning quickly," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Not just the work, but patience, control, understanding." Her cheeks burned, but it was not shame for her mistakes. It was shame for the flutter in her chest, for the undeniable effect he had on her. He was patient, careful, and he respected her space. Yet every brush of his hand, every guiding gesture, seemed to carry an unspoken invitation. That evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs and painted the sky with hues of fire, she caught him watching her from the edge of the village. There was no mockery in his gaze, no claim of ownership. Only attention, measured and deliberate. She felt a shiver run down her spine, an awareness of her own longing that frightened her more than the first night's confinement. In the privacy of their shared dwelling, she stared at her hands, wondering why they trembled. He had touched her, yes, but it was more than that. It was a spark, a revelation of what her body could feel, of how a simple gesture could ignite emotions she had buried deep. Boundaries she had believed unbreakable were already trembling, eroded by patience, respect, and a touch that burned hotter than any flame she had ever known. She could not yet admit to herself that the fear was now mingled with desire, that the man she had once feared was beginning to occupy her thoughts in ways that both terrified and thrilled her. And she knew deep down that this first touch was only the beginning, an awakening that would unravel everything she thought she knew about herself and about him. The days that followed the first touch were a confusing mixture of tension, curiosity, and unspoken desire. She moved through the village with a new awareness of him, of the way he observed her from the corner of his eye, always careful, always patient. But then came the illness, a fever that left her weak, shivering, and barely able to move. It began with a chill that made her teeth chatter, then a pounding headache that blurred the world into streaks of light and shadow. She tried to hide it, to pretend she could manage, but her body betrayed her. Her strength drained away, leaving her trembling and frightened, alone in a teepee that now felt impossibly large. He noticed immediately. He did not scold or demand explanation. Instead, he knelt beside her, assessing her carefully, his hands moving with quiet authority over her forehead, brushing strands of damp hair from her face. "You are burning," he said softly. "You must rest. Drink this." The herbal concoction he handed her smelled strange but earthy and comforting. She swallowed reluctantly, grimacing at the bitter taste, and he remained at her side, silent but steady, his gaze never leaving her. For hours he tended to her, bringing water, adjusting blankets, murmuring calming words that she could not understand fully but felt deep in her chest. She hated how reliant she had become on him, hated the way her pulse quickened when he touched her, even in this simple, caring way. Yet in the quiet of the teepee, with the rain pattering gently outside and the warmth of his presence near her, she could not deny the comfort she felt. He was patient, not just in body but in spirit, attending to her without expectation or judgment. "You are not as weak as you think," he said at one point, his hand brushing hers as he checked her pulse. She flinched, but he did not pull away. "Your body may tremble, but your mind is sharp. You will endure." There was something in the firmness of his words, the steadiness of his hands, that began to crack her remaining walls. She had spent her life defending herself, hiding behind anger and pride, but now for the first time she allowed herself to lean into someone else's care. Not completely, never completely, but enough to feel that perhaps she did not have to face everything alone. The fever persisted through the night, and he stayed by her side. Sometimes she slept. Sometimes she watched him, fascinated by the quiet confidence in his movements. He did not tire, did not complain. He was simply there, a constant presence in a world that had once seemed overwhelming and cruel. And in that presence she felt a strange, dangerous warmth, the beginnings of trust, of reliance, of something more than mere survival. By morning, the worst of her illness had passed. She was still weak, but the world seemed a little less harsh, a little more bearable. She looked at him with new eyes. Not merely the eyes of a frightened girl forced into marriage, but the eyes of someone beginning to recognize the depth of a man's care and the strength behind his calm demeanor. "I thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from fever but sincere. It was the first words she had spoken to him in more than a week that were not defensive, not full of fear or resentment. He only nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. "Do not thank me," he said softly. "It is not a favor. It is what is right." For the first time she allowed herself to see him not as a captor or a stranger, but as a man of honor, of strength, and of quiet tenderness. Her heart fluttered in ways she could not control, and for the first time she admitted to herself, even if only barely, that her boundaries were beginning to shift. He had entered her life with patience, with care, and in that care, he had begun to awaken feelings she had long buried. Curiosity, admiration, and the faintest, most dangerous spark of desire. and she knew, with a shiver that ran deeper than any fever, that she would never be the same. That evening, the village settled into a calm hush, the kind that only comes after a day of labor and learning. Smoke curled lazily from the central fire, carrying the smell of cooked game and warm earth, and the sun bled into the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a strange pull toward the fire, toward the quiet glow that seemed to invite honesty and reflection. He had prepared the space beside the fire for them, a small circle of mats and furs. She hesitated at first, the old fears gnawing at her like persistent ghosts. But something in his gaze, patient and unpressured, coaxed her forward. She lowered herself to the furs, trying not to meet his eyes, though her body betrayed a nervous anticipation she could not name. For a long while, they sat in silence, listening to the crackle of flames and the distant calls of night birds. Then softly he began to speak, not of the village, not of expectations, but of himself, his childhood, the first lessons he had learned in the wilds, the tragedies that had carved him into the young warrior he was today. His voice was steady, yet carried a softness that hinted at wounds hidden beneath strength. She listened, captivated despite herself. Each word peeled away a layer of his mystery, revealing a depth of experience and emotion that she had never expected. There was courage in him, yes, but also pain, loss, and a resilience born of surviving what many could not. And in hearing him speak so honestly, she felt a stirring inside her own chest, a recognition that beneath his exterior, he was human, just as vulnerable, just as alive, as she was. When it was her turn, she hesitated, then began to speak haltingly, sharing fragments of her own life. The bitter winter that had stolen her parents, the loneliness that had followed, and the fear that had driven her to distrust every man who crossed her path. Her voice trembled, but he never interrupted, never judged. He only nodded, encouraging her silently, allowing her the space to reveal herself at her own pace. As she spoke, the walls she had built around herself wavered. She realized, with a mix of awe and fear, that for the first time in her life someone was listening, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but with genuine interest and care. Her defenses, forged through years of loss and hardship, began to crack in the warmth of the firelight and the sincerity of his attention. They shared memories long buried, stories of moments both joyous and sorrowful. Laughter slipped between them as she recounted a childhood misadventure, and he shared tales of youthful mistakes that left him both humbled and wiser. In these shared stories, the first threads of connection wove themselves quietly, invisibly, binding them in a tapestry of understanding and empathy. At one point, he reached out to adjust the blanket around her shoulders, his fingers brushing her arm lightly. She flinched initially but did not pull away completely. The touch, unlike the first shocking contact, carried no expectation, only a gentle reassurance, a reminder that she was not alone. And in that gentle touch, a fire ignited inside her, a recognition that the walls she had built to guard herself were being tested by a presence both patient and commanding. Hours passed, and the stars emerged in the clear night sky, scattered like glitter across a vast dark canvas. They remained by the fire, speaking softly, laughing quietly, and in the spaces between words, the unspoken understanding grew stronger. She realized, with a mixture of fear and thrill, that her perception of him had begun to change. He was no longer merely the young Apache she had been forced to marry. He was a man who had earned her tentative trust, who had begun to occupy her thoughts in ways she could not control. By the time they finally retired for the night, she felt a strange, unfamiliar peace. Boundaries that had once seemed unyielding were now pliable, tested by shared stories, quiet attention, and the simple power of being truly seen. The fire had not only warmed their bodies, it had kindled a fragile, glowing connection, one that promised more than fear, more than obligation. For the first time, she dared to wonder what might come next. The nights had grown warmer, and with them a tension that neither of them could fully name began to linger in the quiet spaces between them. The village slept under a blanket of stars, the only sounds the occasional cry of a distant animal or the whisper of wind through the cliffside trees. Yet in the confines of their shared dwelling, the air seemed charged, heavy with unspoken feelings. She felt it first, a heat that spread across her body whenever he entered the room, a pulse that quickened at the brush of his hand even in the simplest gestures. It frightened her. She had been raised to fear men, to mistrust touch, to see intimacy as danger, and yet, every moment with him eroded those lessons, replacing fear with curiosity and a strange, undeniable longing. It happened one night after chores were done and the fire in the teepee had burned low. He sat near the entrance, sharpening a knife, and she found herself watching him, captivated by the careful precision of his movements. The way his fingers worked, the steady rhythm of his hands, the intensity in his eyes, all of it drew her in, stirring sensations she had never experienced and did not fully understand. Without thinking, she moved closer under the pretense of gathering blankets. Their knees brushed. Her breath hitched. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow until it consisted only of the two of them. The tension between them was electric, charged with every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every subtle brush of skin. You should not be here," she whispered, her voice trembling, though neither of them moved away. "And yet I am," he said softly, his tone steady, patient, yet layered with something deeper she could feel but not name. Her heart hammered in her chest. She knew this was forbidden, dangerous even, but she could not deny the pull between them. Every fiber of her being seemed to respond to him, to the warmth of his body, to the low, controlled strength in his hands and his presence. She felt herself leaning closer, though a small voice in the back of her mind screamed to stop, to retreat, to resist. He reached for her, slowly, deliberately, giving her the choice to pull back. His hand hovered near hers, fingers brushing lightly, testing the boundary. The contact sent a shiver through her, igniting a fire in her chest that she could neither control nor extinguish. Her body betrayed her, leaning subtly into his, craving the warmth, the strength, the connection that had been absent from her life for so long. "You are trembling," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Do not fear what you feel." She did fear it. Fear and longing twisted together in a dangerous knot. Every nerve in her body seemed alive, attuned to him. She knew desire was forbidden in the context of their forced marriage, yet the emotions he stirred were uncontrollable, raw, and insistent. Minutes stretched into hours as they sat in that suspended moment, neither speaking, both acutely aware of the invisible thread binding them together. She realized that this desire, though new and frightening, was real. It was not the fear she had carried into this life, nor the resentment of being forced into marriage. It was something else entirely. A pull toward him that defied reason, expectation and caution. Finally, she pulled back just enough to steady herself, her chest heaving, eyes wide with a mixture of shame, exhilaration, and fear. He did not press, did not judge. He only allowed the moment to exist, teaching her that desire could be acknowledged even in silence, without being forced into action. As she lay down that night, staring at the dim shadows cast by the dying embers, she could not escape the truth. Her thoughts were consumed by him, by the heat of forbidden longing, by the ache of wanting something she was not sure she was allowed to claim. And in that realization she felt both terrified and alive, knowing that the spark he had ignited in her could consume everything she had once believed about fear, control, and love. The morning air carried the scent of smoke and dust, a warning of trouble that had begun to stir on the horizon. Word had reached the village of a small group of rival settlers encroaching on the Apache lands, men armed with rifles and grudges, seeking to claim what did not belong to them. Tension rippled through the village like a living thing, sharp and insistent. She felt fear clawing at her chest, the memory of her parents' deaths and the cruelty of the world pressing heavily on her. But when she glanced at him, her young Apache husband, the man who had slowly, unknowingly begun to unravel her defenses, she saw something new. Unwavering determination. There was no hesitation in his stance, no flicker of doubt in his dark eyes. He would protect the village, protect her, and she knew instinctively that his courage was absolute. The villagers began preparing, reinforcing barriers, gathering weapons. She wanted to shrink away, to hide, to avoid the violence entirely, but he found her before she could escape. "Stay close to me," he instructed, his voice firm but calm. "Do not wander. Do not be afraid. I will not let anyone harm you." Her heart thumped in her chest, not just from fear, but from the trust she placed in him, a trust that had grown steadily through days of observation, care, and shared vulnerability. She nodded, though barely able to believe that she could rely on someone so fully. The attack came in the late afternoon. Shots rang out, startling birds from the trees, and the villagers scrambled for cover. He moved like a shadow, precise and unstoppable, guiding her behind walls, shielding her with his body when gunfire rang too close. She clung to him instinctively, her hands gripping his arm as they ducked behind the palisade. In that moment, all the walls she had built around her heart, fear, anger, resentment, crumbled further. Here was a man who valued her life, who placed her safety above all else, even at the risk of his own. She watched him fight, not recklessly, but with skill and strategy. Every move, every calculated strike revealed not just strength but intelligence, patience, and an unwavering sense of duty. He was fearless yet deliberate, a force of nature tempered by wisdom. She realized with a start that her admiration for him had deepened into something more profound, something that carried the weight of emotion she could no longer deny. When the threat finally retreated, leaving behind only echoes and the quiet of a shaken village, she was trembling not from fear but from relief, awe, and the undeniable surge of feelings she had tried to resist. He turned to her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his dark eyes locking with hers. "You are safe," he said simply. "No one will harm you while I am here." Her breath caught, and she realized in that instant that she believed him, not just in words but in every fiber of her being. The trust that had begun with simple acts of care and patience now blossomed into something more intimate, more profound. She understood finally that he did not just protect her body, he honored her spirit. That night, as the village slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, she lingered by the fire, her mind replaying the day's events. She remembered the fear, yes, but more than that. She remembered the strength, the courage, the unwavering commitment he had shown. And with that memory came a revelation. She no longer feared the young Apache who had been thrust into her life. She revered him. She respected him. And deep down she felt the first undeniable stirrings of love. A love born not from circumstance, but from admiration, trust, and the intimate knowledge of his courage. Her boundaries had been tested, her fears confronted, and in the heat of survival and shared struggle, the spark that had begun with a mere touch now burned brighter, hotter, impossible to ignore. She knew that whatever came next, she would face it with him, not as a frightened, reluctant bride, but as someone who had glimpsed the depth of his soul and could not turn away. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if love could truly bloom from the ashes of fear, and the answer came as a quiet, undeniable certainty. The night air was still, the kind of heavy silence that follows a day of tension and triumph. The village lay quiet beneath a blanket of stars, the only sounds the soft crackle of fires and the distant call of nocturnal creatures. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and unsteady, and she knew it was not only from the adrenaline of the recent threat. He was beside her, tending the last flickering embers of their fire. His movements were calm, deliberate, and yet there was a tension in the way he glanced at her that made her stomach flutter. She had never seen him like this before, not in anger, not in battle, but here, in the intimate quiet that belonged only to them. "I cannot promise what the world will bring," he said softly, breaking the silence, "but I can promise that I will stand by you, always." She felt something inside her loosen, a weight she had carried since the moment she had been forced into this marriage. Fear, resentment, distrust. It all seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his words, in the steadiness of his presence. For the first time, she realized that she did not have to guard herself completely, that surrendering did not mean losing everything, but perhaps gaining something she had never dared imagine: love. Her gaze lifted to meet his, and she saw the same intensity there that she felt in her own chest. His eyes were no longer just the eyes of the man who had taken her by circumstance. They were the eyes of someone who had come to know her, to care for her, to desire her, not as a possession, but as a partner and equal in this strange, unchosen life. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out her hand. His fingers brushed against hers lightly, testing the connection, and she did not pull away. The contact was electric, sending a warmth through her that made her cheeks burn and her breath catch. She had resisted for so long, fought the pull of desire and fear alike, but now there was nothing left to hold her back. He drew her closer, careful, patient, yet undeniable in his intent. Their bodies aligned, not with violence or force, but with a natural, inevitable rhythm. Her pulse raced, every nerve alive as she felt the heat of him, the steady strength that had protected her through fear, illness, and danger. For the first time, she let herself lean fully into him, into the intimacy that had been building silently over weeks of shared moments, glances, touches, and understanding. Their lips met softly at first, a whisper of connection that carried all the unspoken emotions of their time together. Desire, trust, fear, admiration all mingled into a single consuming fire. She clung to him not out of desperation, but out of recognition that this was where she belonged, at least for this moment, in the safety, warmth, and power of his arms. Hours seemed to stretch as they surrendered to each other, the world outside forgotten. He explored her with a gentleness that left her breathless, attentive to her reactions, patient with every hesitation and need. She allowed herself to respond fully, finally understanding that surrender was not weakness, it was a choice, a recognition of trust and passion in the deep, unspoken bond they had cultivated. By the time the first hints of dawn brushed the sky, she lay against him, heart racing, body exhausted, but her mind and soul at peace in a way they had never known. The fire between them was not only physical, it was emotional, spiritual, a testament to the slow, careful unwrapping of walls, the gentle building of trust, the undeniable pull of love that had been forbidden, resisted yet inevitable. For the first time, she did not feel fear. She did not feel anger. She only felt the warmth, the strength, and the undeniable truth. She had surrendered, and in doing so, she had discovered a love that burned away every boundary she had once clung to so tightly. And as the sun rose over the cliffs, bathing the village in golden light, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The months that followed were unlike anything she could have imagined. The young Apache she had been forced to marry was no longer just a figure of fear or duty. He had become the center of her world, the steady presence that grounded her and the fire that stirred her heart in ways she had once thought impossible. Their connection, forged through shared danger, quiet moments, and surrender to desire, had grown into something far deeper: trust, companionship, and a love neither had expected. The village had accepted her slowly, cautiously, as they observed her transformation. She was no longer the frightened, defiant girl who had arrived trembling in a shawl. She moved with purpose, learning the ways of the people around her, helping with daily tasks, tending to children, and assisting in hunting and gathering. Her husband watched her closely, always nearby but never overbearing, offering guidance and encouragement with a patience that left her both humbled and emboldened. It was during these quiet routines that she realized the depth of her own change. The fear that had once dominated her every thought had faded, replaced with confidence, understanding, and the recognition of her own strength. She had learned not just to survive in this new life, but to thrive, to claim space, to speak, to act, and to love fully. He, too, had changed in her presence. She saw it in the way he laughed more freely, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, and the subtle gestures that betrayed the depth of his affection. Their nights were no longer merely a surrender to desire. They had become a sacred ritual of intimacy, a reaffirmation of the bond they had forged in fire and shadow, in fear and courage. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a fence along the edge of the village, he paused and took her hand in his. The sunlight caught the glint of his dark eyes, and she felt a familiar warmth surge through her chest. "You have grown stronger than I could have imagined," he said quietly, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "Not just in body, but in spirit. I am proud of you." Her heart swelled, a mixture of pride, love, and gratitude. She realized that in the months since their first night together, she had found not just safety, not just desire, but a home, one that existed in his presence, in their shared world, and in the life they were building together. Evenings were spent near the fire as they had begun weeks before, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet conversation. But now there was a lightness, a joy that had not existed before. She had learned to trust fully, to lean into love without fear, to embrace the intimacy and passion that had once seemed so dangerous. Each touch, each glance, each whispered word strengthened the bond they shared, weaving them together in ways that were both physical and spiritual. Over time, the villagers came to see her not as an outsider, but as a vital part of the community. Her presence brought balance, compassion, and energy, while he continued to protect, guide, and teach. Together they became a formidable pair, partners in every sense of the word, respected, admired, and quietly revered. One night, as they watched the stars from a small cliff overlooking the village, she rested her head against his shoulder. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and the world seemed impossibly wide and full of possibility. "I never imagined life could feel like this," she whispered. "Neither did I," he admitted, his arms circling her waist, holding her close. "And yet here we are, together," she smiled, feeling the truth of it deep in her soul. The forced marriage that had once filled her with dread had become the foundation of a love that burned brighter than any fear she had known. She had surrendered, she had trusted, and in doing so, she had found a life rich with passion, connection, and belonging. As the night deepened and the stars shimmered above them, she realized fully that she was home, not in a place, not in circumstance, but in the arms of the man who had taught her the meaning of love. Boundaries that had once seemed immovable had been burned away, leaving only the heat, the light, and the enduring fire of a love that would carry them through all the days to come. And in that moment, she knew without question, this was her life now, and she would embrace it fully with him by her side.